They called it the Jewel of France, but its glittering halls were built atop graves. Beneath Versailles, before the mirrors, the chandeliers, and the golden throne, lay thousands of forgotten souls, buried, erased, and disturbed to fuel a king's vanity. As Louis XIV raised his palace to the heavens, something ancient awoke below. Whispers filled the walls. Faces appeared in the glass. Musicians played songs no one knew, in languages no one spoke. Versailles wasn't just haunted, it was cursed. Like, if you believe the dead remember. Comment, if power built on bones can ever be holy. And subscribe, to uncover the palace that glittered while ghosts wept beneath its floors. The morning mist clung to the ancient stones like the breath of the dead, and in that ethereal silence, you could almost hear the whispers of those who once lay beneath. This is not merely a story about architecture or royal ambition. This is a tale that will make you question everything you believe about the price of power, the weight of history, and the terrible consequences of building your dreams upon the bones of the forgotten. In the heart of what would become one of Europe's most magnificent palaces, there once stretched an endless field of unmarked graves. Thousands upon thousands of souls, their names lost to time, their stories buried beneath layers of earth and royal decree. But the dead, as you will discover, do not rest quietly when their peace is disturbed for the sake of vanity and political grandeur. The year was 1661, and the Sun King, Louis XIV of France, stood at the precipice of his greatest architectural ambition. Versailles, a name that would echo through the corridors of history like a magnificent symphony, but also like a funeral dirge for those whose final resting place would be desecrated in the name of royal glory. The young king, barely 23 years old, gazed upon the modest hunting lodge that his father had built, but his vision extended far beyond those humble walls. He saw marble columns reaching toward heaven, gilded halls that would blind visitors with their splendor, and gardens that would stretch to the horizon like an earthly paradise. But beneath his feet, beneath the very ground where he planned to build his monument to absolute monarchy, lay the forgotten cemetery of the village of Versailles. For centuries, the humble peasants and craftsmen of this small community had been laid to rest in this sacred ground, their bodies returning to the earth that had sustained their lives. Their graves were simple, marked only by wooden crosses that time, and weather had slowly eroded. But their presence was profound, a silent testament to generations of human struggle, love, loss, and hope. The king's architects, led by the brilliant but ruthlessly pragmatic Louis XIV, presented their master with a problem that would have given pause to a less ambitious ruler. The proposed site for the palace expansion encompassed not just the old cemetery, but also portions of the village church and several smaller burial grounds that had served the community for over 400 years. To build the palace of Louis's dreams, they would need to move not just the living, but the dead. What followed was one of the most systematically planned and executed desecrations in European history, carried out with the cold efficiency that would later characterize the absolute monarchy Louis was constructing. In the dead of winter, when the ground was frozen and the nights were longest, teams of workers began the grim task of exhuming the cemetery. They worked by torchlight, their breath forming clouds in the bitter air, as they carefully removed coffin after coffin, skeleton after skeleton, from their eternal rest. The operation was shrouded in secrecy and carried out with military precision. The king had decreed that the work must be completed quickly and quietly, before word could spread to the surrounding villages and potentially spark unrest among the peasantry. After all, desecrating the dead was not just a practical concern. It was a profound violation of everything these simple people held sacred about death, memory, and the continuity between the living and the departed. But as the workers dug deeper into the ancient soil, they began to uncover more than just individual graves. They found evidence of burials that stretched back not just decades, but centuries. Layer upon layer of human remains, some in coffins that had long since rotted away, others wrapped in simple shrouds that crumbled at the touch. The cemetery, they realized, was far older and more extensive than anyone had imagined. Generation after generation of the people of Versailles had been laid to rest here, creating a vast underground city of the dead directly beneath where the king intended to build his most magnificent reception halls. The psychological impact on the workers was immediate and profound. Many of them were local men, peasants and craftsmen, who had grown up hearing stories of their ancestors buried in this very ground. Now they were being asked to disturb those ancestors, to treat their remains not as sacred relics of human life, but as obstacles to be cleared away like rocks or fallen trees. Some refused to continue and fled into the night, abandoning their wages rather than participate further in what they saw as a monstrous sacrilege. But the king's will was absolute, and there were always other men desperate enough for work to take their place. The exhumation continued night after night, week after week, through the harsh winter of 1661 and into the spring of 1662. The remains were loaded onto carts and transported to a new burial ground several miles away, a hastily consecrated plot of land that would serve as the final resting place for the displaced dead. But in their haste and secrecy, the workers made little effort to maintain any record of who was being moved or where they were being reburied. Names, families, generations of memory, all of it was lost in the mechanical process of clearing the site for royal construction. As the last of the graves were emptied and the ground was leveled for construction, strange reports began to circulate among the workers and the few local residents who remained in the area. They spoke of lights moving through the construction site at night, of voices calling out in the darkness, of tools that would be found moved or missing each morning despite being carefully secured the evening before. The horses used to transport building materials became skittish and difficult to control when they approached certain areas of the site, rearing and whinnying as if sensing some invisible presence that terrified them. The king's advisors dismissed these reports as the superstitious ramblings of ignorant peasants, but privately, some of them began to worry about the potential consequences of what they had done. The Catholic Church, while officially sanctioning the project, had expressed concern about the proper treatment of the displaced remains and had insisted on elaborate blessing ceremonies for the new burial ground. But even the most devout among the king's court wondered whether such rituals could truly appease the spirits of those whose rest had been so violently disturbed. Construction of the new palace began in earnest in the spring of 1662, and from the very beginning, the project was plagued by accidents and setbacks that seemed to defy rational explanation. Workers would arrive at the site to find that walls built the previous day had somehow collapsed during the night, despite being constructed according to proven techniques and using the finest materials. Tools would break at crucial moments, scaffolding would fail without warning, and several workers died in accidents that veteran builders described as unprecedented in their experience. The king himself seemed unaware of these problems, or perhaps he simply chose to ignore them in his determination to see his vision realized. He would arrive at the construction site each morning, immaculately dressed and radiating the confidence that would later earn him the title of the Sun King, and he would stride across the ground where thousands of his subjects had once been buried as if it were nothing more than a foundation for his glory. His architects and engineers learned not to trouble him with reports of the mysterious delays and accidents, instead working longer hours and hiring additional crews to compensate for the inexplicable setbacks. But as the palace began to take shape, rising from the disturbed earth like some magnificent phoenix, the strange occurrences only intensified. Servants reported hearing footsteps in the corridors late at night, long before the palace was inhabited. Musicians brought in to test the acoustics of the great halls complained that their instruments would go out of tune without explanation, and that they could hear faint melodies echoing through the empty rooms, melodies that none of them recognized, played in styles that seemed to belong to much earlier eras. The gardens, which were to be Louis's pride and joy, presented their own mysterious challenges. Plants would wither and die for no apparent reason, despite being tended by the most skilled gardeners in France. Certain areas of the carefully planned landscape seemed to resist all attempts at cultivation, as if the very soil was rejecting the seeds and saplings placed within it. André Lenotre, the master gardener responsible for creating what would become the most famous formal gardens in the world, privately confided to his assistants that he had never encountered earth that seemed so hostile to new life. As the years passed and the palace neared completion, the stories of supernatural activity began to take on a more specific and disturbing character. Courtiers who came to visit the king in his new residence reported seeing figures in outdated clothing walking through the halls, always at the periphery of their vision, always vanishing when they turned to look directly. These apparitions were described as peasants and common folk, dressed in the simple garments of country people from generations past, their faces bearing expressions of profound sadness and confusion. The most frequent sightings occurred in the Hall of Mirrors, the palace's most magnificent chamber, where 17 mirror-clad arches reflected the light from the gardens in a display of optical brilliance that left visitors breathless with wonder. But many of those same visitors reported that the mirrors sometimes reflected more than just the room and its occupants. They claimed to see crowds of people in peasant clothing standing behind them, transparent figures that appeared in the mirrors but cast no reflections in the polished marble floors. The king himself never admitted to seeing anything unusual, but those closest to him began to notice changes in his behavior. He became increasingly insistent on having large numbers of courtiers around him at all times, as if he found solitude unbearable. He demanded that candles be kept burning throughout the palace every night, claiming that the light was necessary for security, but servants noticed that he seemed genuinely uncomfortable in darkness. Most tellingly, he developed an obsession with the chapel, attending multiple religious services each day, and insisting that priests be available at all hours to perform blessings and consecrations. The completion of Versailles in 1682 marked the beginning of Louis XIV's absolute monarchy at its most magnificent and terrible height. The palace became the center of European culture and politics, attracting visitors from across the continent who came to marvel at its unprecedented luxury and grandeur. But even as the king basked in the admiration of his peers and the submission of his subjects, the strange phenomena that had plagued the construction continued to manifest within the completed palace. New arrivals at court were often startled by their first nights in the palace, reporting dreams of extraordinary vividness in which they found themselves surrounded by crowds of angry, sorrowful people who seemed to be demanding something from them. Recognition, perhaps, or justice, or simply acknowledgement of their existence. These dreams were so common and so similar in their details that they became an accepted part of the Versailles experience, something that new courtiers were quietly warned about by their more experienced colleagues. The palace's servants, who lived and worked within its walls year-round, developed their own folklore around the supernatural presences they encountered. They spoke of certain rooms that were always cold, no matter how many fires were lit within them. They told stories of invisible hands that would extinguish candles, of doors that would open and close on their own, of whispered conversations in dialects so archaic that no one could understand their meaning. Most disturbing of all were the reports of crying that could be heard echoing through the servants' quarters late at night, the sound of children weeping, though no living children were housed in those areas of the palace. As Louis XIV aged, and his reign stretched on for decades, the weight of what had been done to build Versailles seemed to press ever more heavily upon the palace and all who dwelt within it. The king's later years were marked by personal tragedies that his courtiers whispered might be connected to the curse of the displaced dead. His beloved wife died young, his son and heir predeceased him, and one by one the members of his immediate family fell victim to diseases and accidents that seemed to strike with supernatural precision. The financial cost of maintaining Versailles and the lifestyle it represented began to strain even the vast resources of the French monarchy. The king found himself borrowing enormous sums to fund the constant renovations and improvements that the palace seemed to demand, as if the building itself was a hungry entity that could never be satisfied. Critics of the monarchy began to point out that the money spent on a single room's decoration could have fed entire provinces for a year, but Louis seemed incapable of moderating his expenditure on his architectural obsession. The aristocracy that surrounded the king at Versailles developed a culture of elaborate ritual and ceremony that served, perhaps unconsciously, as a kind of protective barrier against the uncomfortable reality of what lay beneath their feet. Every moment of every day was governed by strict protocols that left little time for reflection or solitude. The constant social demands, the endless rounds of entertainment and political maneuvering, the elaborate fashions and complex etiquette, all of it seemed designed to distract from any deeper contemplation of the palace's foundations. But the dead, it seemed, were not so easily ignored. As the reign of Louis XIV entered its final decades, the reports of supernatural activity at Versailles became more frequent and more dramatic. Entire groups of courtiers would witness the same apparitions simultaneously, making it impossible to dismiss these experiences as individual delusions or tricks of light. The palace's priests found themselves called upon more and more frequently to perform exorcisms and blessing ceremonies. Though they were careful never to acknowledge publicly that such interventions were necessary. The most dramatic incidents occurred during the great court ceremonies that were the highlight of life at Versailles. During a particularly elaborate celebration of the king's birthday in 1708, multiple witnesses reported that the mirrors in the Hall of Mirrors began to cloud over with what appeared to be breath, despite the fact that no one was standing close enough to cause such an effect. The clouding formed patterns that some observers claimed to recognize as words in an archaic form of French, though the meaning was never definitively established. During another grand ball, the orchestra playing in the gallery above the main ballroom reported that their instruments began to play additional notes that none of them were producing, harmonies and melodies that seemed to emanate from the air itself, creating music of haunting beauty but profoundly melancholic character. The dancing stopped as courtiers and foreign dignitaries alike stood transfixed by the ethereal music, until the king himself ordered the orchestra to cease playing entirely. But even after the musicians had put down their instruments, witnesses claimed that the ghostly melodies continued for several minutes before gradually fading into silence. The psychological atmosphere of Versailles during these later years was one of magnificent decay, of beauty built upon horror, of civilization constructed over barbarism. The courtiers who lived within the palace's walls found themselves trapped in a world of impossible luxury that they gradually came to understand was haunted not just by supernatural presences, but by the moral weight of the injustice upon which their entire way of life was founded. The king's death in 1715 brought no peace to Versailles. If anything, the supernatural activity seemed to intensify during the regency that followed, as if the iron will that had held the palace's darker forces in check had been removed. Louis XV, who inherited the throne as a child, was reportedly so frightened by his experiences in the palace that he spent much of his youth in other royal residences, returning to Versailles only when absolutely necessary for state functions. The new generation of courtiers who came to prominence during the regency brought with them a more philosophical and questioning attitude toward the mysteries of Versailles. Influenced by the emerging Enlightenment ideas about reason and scientific inquiry, some of them began to investigate the palace's supernatural phenomena more systematically. They discovered records that previous generations had tried to suppress, documents detailing the extent of the cemetery that had been destroyed, lists of the villages and churches that had been demolished, accounts of the resistance that local populations had offered to the palace's construction. These investigations revealed that the desecration of the cemetery was even more extensive than had been previously acknowledged. Not only had thousands of individual graves been disturbed, but the site had also contained several mass burial grounds dating back to medieval plagues and famines. Entire generations of the people of Versailles and the surrounding region had been interred in the ground beneath the palace, creating what amounted to a vast necropolis that had been systematically erased from history to make way for royal grandeur. The moral implications of these discoveries were staggering. The palace that had been presented to the world as the ultimate expression of divine monarchy and absolute royal authority was revealed to be built, quite literally, upon the bones of the king's subjects. Every step taken through the magnificent halls, every dance performed in the glittering ballrooms, every ceremony conducted in the elaborate state apartments, all of it was happening above the remains of thousands of people whose names had been forgotten and whose final rest had been violated in the service of one man's vanity. As the 18th century progressed and the ideas of the Enlightenment gained influence among the French intellectual elite, Versailles began to be seen by critics as a symbol not just of royal excess, but of the fundamental injustice upon which the old monarchy was based. Philosophers and political theorists pointed to the palace as evidence of the complete disconnect between the ruling class and the people they claimed to serve. How could a king claim to rule by divine right when his very palace was built upon the desecrated graves of his subjects? The supernatural phenomena that continued to plague Versailles during this period seemed to many observers to represent the voice of the common people, speaking from beyond the grave to demand recognition and justice. The apparitions that appeared in the mirrors were no longer seen as mere curiosities or sources of entertainment, but as witnesses to historical crimes that had never been acknowledged or punished. The ghostly music that echoed through the halls was interpreted as the songs of the displaced dead, melodies from a lost world of village festivals and communal celebrations that had been destroyed to make way for aristocratic entertainment. Marie Antoinette, who arrived at Versailles as a young Austrian princess, was particularly affected by the palace's supernatural atmosphere. Sensitive and imaginative by nature, she reportedly experienced vivid dreams and waking visions that left her deeply troubled. She became obsessed with creating alternative spaces within the palace grounds, the famous Petit Trianon, and the artificial village where she would dress as a shepherdess and play at being a common peasant. These elaborate fantasies can be understood as attempts to escape not just the pressures of court life, but the psychological weight of living above the bones of the very people she was pretending to be. The Queen's fascination with pastoral simplicity and her famous remark about cake being offered to those who lacked bread take on a darker significance when viewed in the context of Versailles' foundation upon a destroyed cemetery. Her apparent inability to understand the suffering of the French people may have been exacerbated by her daily life in a palace that had literally erased the physical evidence of common people's existence, replacing their graves with marble floors and gilded walls that made it possible to forget entirely that ordinary people had ever lived and died on this ground. As the financial crisis that would eventually lead to the French Revolution began to grip the monarchy, the supernatural activity at Versailles seemed to reach a crescendo. Witnesses reported that the apparitions became more numerous and more aggressive, no longer content to manifest quietly at the edges of perception. During state dinners, ghostly figures would appear to walk among the guests, sometimes brushing against the elaborate costumes of courtiers or even seeming to whisper in their ears. The palace's animals, the hunting dogs and horses that were essential to aristocratic life, became increasingly agitated and difficult to control, as if they sensed presences that human senses could not fully detect. The mirrors that had once been the pride of the Hall of Mirrors began to show disturbing images, even when no one was looking into them. Servants cleaning the great chamber would glance up to see crowds of angry faces staring back at them from the reflective surfaces, faces wearing expressions of accusation and demand that left the viewers shaken and terrified. Some mirrors had to be covered with cloth because the images they displayed were too disturbing for the courtiers to bear. The final years before the revolution were marked by a series of supernatural incidents that seemed to presage the political catastrophe that was approaching. During a particularly elaborate court ceremony in 1788, the candles throughout the palace began to flicker and dim simultaneously, despite there being no wind or other natural explanation for the phenomenon. As the assembled courtiers stood in growing darkness, witnesses reported hearing what sounded like thousands of voices rising from beneath the floor, not words that could be understood, but a collective sound of mourning and anger that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. When the revolution finally came, and the royal family was forced to leave Versailles, many observers noted that the palace seemed to exhale with relief, as if a tremendous pressure had been lifted from its walls. The supernatural phenomena that had plagued the building for over a century diminished dramatically, though they never disappeared entirely. It was as if the departure of the monarchy had partially satisfied the demands of the displaced dead, though their complete rest would require more than just the absence of kings and queens. The revolutionary government that took control of France faced the question of what to do with Versailles, a building that represented everything they claimed to oppose, but which was also one of the most magnificent architectural achievements in European history. Some radicals called for its complete destruction, arguing that it was a monument to oppression that should be erased as thoroughly as the cemetery that had been destroyed to build it. Others argued for its preservation as a museum and symbol of the people's victory over tyranny. During the revolutionary period, strange reports began to circulate about the palace's behavior during this time of political upheaval. Guards stationed at the empty building reported that the supernatural activity seemed to change in character, becoming less threatening and more welcoming. The apparitions that had once appeared angry and demanding now seemed to watch over the palace with expressions of satisfaction, as if they approved of the royal family's departure and the promise of a more just social order. The ghostly music that echoed through the halls took on a different quality as well, shifting from melancholy laments to what sounded like celebrations. Some witnesses claimed to hear what sounded like village festivals and peasant songs, the kind of communal music that might have been heard in the area before the palace's construction, but which had been silent for over a century. It was as if the spirits of the displaced dead were finally able to express joy at the downfall of the system that had destroyed their resting place. Napoleon's rise to power brought a new relationship with Versailles, as the emperor understood both the political necessity of rejecting the old monarchy and the practical value of magnificent settings for displaying imperial authority. However, his attempts to use the palace for his own purposes were reportedly plagued by the same supernatural phenomena that had troubled the Bourbon kings. The difference was that Napoleon, unlike his predecessors, seemed to understand that he was dealing with the consequences of historical injustice rather than mere superstition. According to accounts from this period, Napoleon ordered investigations into the full extent of the cemetery that had been destroyed to build the palace. His researchers discovered that the desecration had been even more extensive than previous records had indicated, involving not just the main village cemetery, but also numerous smaller burial grounds, family plots, and sacred sites that had served the spiritual needs of the local population for centuries. The total number of graves that had been disturbed was estimated to be well into the tens of thousands. Armed with this knowledge, Napoleon reportedly ordered a series of memorial ceremonies designed to acknowledge the injustice that had been done and to honor the memory of those whose graves had been violated. These ceremonies were conducted in secret, as the emperor understood that public acknowledgement of the palace's dark foundations might undermine his own authority. But according to witnesses, the supernatural activity at Versailles diminished significantly following these rituals, as if the formal recognition of the historical crime had begun the process of healing. The restoration of the Bourbon monarchy after Napoleon's defeat brought renewed supernatural activity to Versailles, though the returned kings seem to have learned from their predecessors' experiences. Louis XIV and Charles V used the palace sparingly, preferring other residences for their daily activities and limiting their time at Versailles to necessary state functions. Both kings reportedly consulted with priests and scholars about the proper way to address the spiritual disturbances that continued to manifest in the building. It was during this period that the most systematic attempts were made to research and document the supernatural phenomena at Versailles. Scholars and ecclesiastical authorities compiled detailed records of the apparitions, the mysterious sounds, and the other unexplained events that continued to occur within the palace walls. These documents, many of which remain in church and government archives, provide a remarkable record of sustained supernatural activity spanning nearly 2 centuries. The July Revolution of 1830, which brought Louis Philippe to power, marked another turning point in the supernatural history of Versailles. The new king, who styled himself as the citizen king and attempted to bridge the gap between monarchy and republicanism, made a remarkable decision regarding the palace. Rather than using it as a royal residence, he transformed it into a museum dedicated to all the glories of France, explicitly including both royal and revolutionary history. This transformation seemed to have a profound effect on the supernatural atmosphere of the palace. For the first time since its construction, Versailles was being used not to glorify a single monarch or dynasty, but to honor the entire history of the French people, including, implicitly, those whose graves had been destroyed to build it. Visitors to the new museum reported that the supernatural phenomena became less threatening and more instructive, as if the spirits of the displaced dead were finally able to serve as guides to the full history of their homeland. The museum version of Versailles attracted visitors from around the world, many of whom came not just to admire the artistic and architectural achievements of the palace, but to experience its supernatural aspects. Ghost tours and seances became popular activities, though the museum authorities generally discouraged such pursuits. Nevertheless, the stories of supernatural encounters continued to accumulate, creating a folklore around Versailles that rivaled the historical accounts of its construction and political significance. As the 19th century progressed and industrialization transformed French society, the supernatural phenomena at Versailles began to take on new meanings and interpretations. Romantic writers and artists saw the ghostly manifestations as symbols of the eternal conflict between civilization and nature, between progress and tradition, between the powerful and the powerless. The palace became a favorite subject for Gothic novels and supernatural literature, inspiring countless fictional accounts of hauntings and supernatural encounters. But for those who experienced the phenomena firsthand, the supernatural aspects of Versailles remained a deeply personal and often life-changing experience. Visitors would arrive as skeptics and leave as believers, shaken by encounters with presences that seemed to embody the collective memory of centuries of human suffering and injustice. The palace became a place of pilgrimage, not just for lovers of art and history, but for those seeking to understand the spiritual consequences of political and social oppression. The establishment of the French Third Republic in 1870 brought yet another perspective to the interpretation of Versailles' supernatural phenomena. Republican intellectuals and politicians saw the ghostly manifestations as evidence of the crimes of the old regime and proof of the necessity of democratic government. The apparitions were interpreted as the voices of the people speaking from beyond the grave to demand recognition and justice that had been denied them in life. During this period, serious scientific investigations were conducted into the supernatural phenomena at Versailles. Researchers using the latest techniques in psychology and physics attempted to document and explain the strange occurrences that continued to manifest within the palace. While these investigations failed to provide definitive explanations for the phenomena, they did establish that the experiences were widespread, consistent, and seemed to be genuinely perceived rather than imagined or fabricated. The 20th century brought new challenges and interpretations to the supernatural legacy of Versailles. 2 world wars saw the palace serve various military and diplomatic functions, and personnel stationed there during these periods added their own accounts to the growing collection of supernatural encounters. Soldiers and officials reported that the ghostly phenomena seemed to intensify during times of national crisis, as if the spirits of the displaced dead were responding to threats against the nation they had served in life. The restoration work that began in earnest during the latter half of the 20th century provided new opportunities to investigate the physical foundations of the palace and to uncover additional evidence of the cemetery that had been destroyed during its construction. Archaeological excavations revealed human remains that had been missed during the original clearing of the site, confirming the accounts of the extensive desecration that had taken place. These discoveries were treated with appropriate reverence, and the remains were given proper burial in consecrated ground. Modern visitors to Versailles continue to report supernatural encounters, though the character of these experiences has evolved over the centuries. The angry, demanding apparitions of the early years have given way to presences that seem more sorrowful than threatening, more concerned with being remembered than with seeking revenge. The ghostly music that echoes through the halls now seems to celebrate the palace's transformation from a symbol of oppression to a monument to human achievement and historical memory. The story of Versailles and its foundation upon a destroyed cemetery serves as a powerful metaphor for the relationship between power and memory, between individual ambition and collective consequence. The palace stands today as one of the world's most magnificent architectural achievements, but it also serves as a reminder of the human cost of such grandeur. Every visitor who walks through its gilded halls treads upon ground that was once sacred to thousands of ordinary people whose names have been forgotten, but whose presence continues to be felt. The supernatural phenomena that have been reported at Versailles for over 3 centuries can be understood in many ways, as literal manifestations of restless spirits, as psychological responses to the knowledge of historical injustice, as symbolic representations of collective memory and cultural trauma. Regardless of one's beliefs about the reality of ghosts and hauntings, the story of Versailles demonstrates the impossibility of completely erasing the past, no matter how powerful the forces that attempt to do so. In our modern age, when development and progress often require the destruction of historical sites and the displacement of communities, the story of Versailles serves as a cautionary tale about the long-term consequences of treating human beings and their sacred places as obstacles to be cleared away. The palace reminds us that true magnificence cannot be built upon a foundation of injustice, and that the voices of the displaced and forgotten will find ways to make themselves heard, even across the centuries. The legacy of Versailles continues to evolve as each generation brings new perspectives to its interpretation and significance. What remains constant is the recognition that this magnificent palace, for all its beauty and historical importance, stands as a testament to both human achievement and human failing. It reminds us that power without justice is ultimately hollow, that beauty built upon suffering carries within it the seeds of its own haunting, and that the dead, no matter how thoroughly they may seem to be forgotten, never truly rest until their stories are acknowledged and their sacrifices honored. As you stand today in the Hall of Mirrors, looking out upon the magnificent gardens that stretch toward the horizon. Remember that beneath your feet lie the bones of thousands of people whose only crime was to have lived and died in the path of royal ambition. Their presence transforms every reflection in those famous mirrors into a reminder of the cost of absolute power, and every echo in those gilded halls into a whisper of the voices that were silenced to create this monument to monarchical glory. The palace that was built upon a cemetery continues to be haunted not by supernatural forces, but by the weight of historical truth, a truth that no amount of gold leaf or marble polish can ever completely obscure. Versailles rose as a monument to divine monarchy, but every step through its halls echoed with the silence of the displaced dead. It dazzled the world, yet it was always haunted, not by ghosts, but by truth. A palace forged from desecration cannot rest in peace. If this haunted legacy shook you, like this video, comment, whose voice history erased, and subscribe to never forget the empire built on sacred ground.